Okay, we are live.
Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. صباح الخير, مساء الخير, مساء النور. This is the panel discussion, roundtable discussion on how has Palestine transformed feminist praxis. And we start first and with Professor Tomomi Kinukawa for land acknowledgement.
Yes, thank you. So I'll read the land acknowledgement for San Francisco State University. According to the Department of American Indian Studies at our campus, the campuses of San Francisco State University on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay are located within the occupied territories of the Ramaytush, Ohlone, and coastal Miwok, who, along with the Southern Pomo, are organized as the Federated Indians of Granton Rancheria.
And we'd like to take this moment to ask for everybody to take a moment of silence for the fallen, for the struggle for freedom and justice, dignity, and peace for all over the world, in Palestine, in Gaza, and all over the world. Thank you.
We'd like to start with expressing our gratitude for those who made this open classroom possible. So we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Feminist for Justice in and for Palestine, Teaching Palestine, and Ahmed Studies. We'd also like to thank all the individuals without whose efforts this event would not have been possible. The late Graham, who created the design for the flyer, and also helping us today for social media, Mariam Karim and Dean Ashri, who are also supporting the social media, and also Late and Dean are also helping us for providing us with tech support. Late and Dean will now introduce themselves.
Thank you so much. Honored to be here. My name is Lean, and I am an intern with Dr. Abdulhadi. I work with Teaching Palestine and Ahmed. I graduated from the American University of Beirut. I studied media and communications. I am originally from Lebanon, the south of Lebanon, which is now heavily being bombed as we speak by the Israeli occupation. My family has since evacuated the village, but nowhere is safe. So we pray for everyone's safety and for the safety of the people in Gaza and people everywhere who are affected by the Zionist project. And I'm very happy to be learning and to be here with you all. Laith.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laith Galoom. I'm a graduate student in Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. I've been helping with the Teaching Palestine and Ahmed Studies open classrooms for some time now. I'm just happy to be here and keep learning.
Thank you. The classes that will be joining us today are three of my classes and two sections of Professor Kinukawa's classes. I will mention them. Professor Kinukawa is teaching Women and Gender in U.S. History, Women and Gender Studies 150. I am teaching three Ahmed, Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies classes, Islamophobia, Palestine, and Comparative Border Studies, Palestine and Mexico. And we would like our colleagues, when you are joining us, when you introduce yourself, please also say if you say your classes are joining us, which classes, or if they're going to be watching afterwards, or having assignments with that. And now I'm going to turn it over to my, I'm going to basically just frame how we're starting it on International Working Women's Day, March 8th. Many of us who are here today and some colleagues who are not here with us, we organized a virtual classroom to commemorate International Women's Day with several Palestinian women on Palestine, genocide, colonialism, and feminist liberation. And that included several Palestinian women, including Dr. Lina Maari, who's the president of the Faculty and Staff Union at Birzeit University and member and professor of the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit, Dr. Areen Hawari, who is the director and the gender projects director at Mada al-Karmel, which is the only research center for Palestinians inside the occupied 1948 areas. There is no other place where Palestinians can do that in the settler racist colonial state of Israel. We had Buthaina As-Samiri, who works with Birzeit University, specifically with the Right to Education campaign, who spoke about Gaza and her family and what's going on there, and analysis. We had Yafa Jarrar, who is a lawyer and a member of Lober for Palestine, as well as the campaign for academic and cultural boycott of Israel, and a daughter of one of the Palestinian women prisoners. We also had Hanan Al-Khatib, who's also a lawyer and representing the Independent Palestinian Commission for Captives and Prisoners, who has been also a lawyer for Khalida Jarrar, the mother of the Palestinian the Palestinian women prisoners in the Amun prison. And they explained that, and the event we have is available online. You can watch it on YouTube and hear the words of the Palestinian feminists. They made calls specifically that we are trying to address today, and this is why we're having our event today. They demanded an end to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and they stressed that every minute, every second counts, and demanded the end to the settler colonial regime in general, in Palestine and elsewhere, and freeing Palestine and freeing all prisoners. They demanded to expose and end Israeli settler colonial sexual violence against Palestinian women, men, trans, and queers. They demanded an immediate investigation commission of the conditions of Israeli prisons, and they demanded that the Red Cross fulfill its mandate that it has been ignoring, to visit Palestinian prisoners and make sure that they are consulting on their conditions, since they, aside from their prisoner lawyers, nobody visits them. They emphasized the principle of co-liberation against the colluding states. We mentioned US and Israel, but we could also add a number of states such as India and such as other places that are working on this. And they highlighted the Palestinian sumud, or steadfastness, and the importance of anti-colonial resistance from within colonial prisons, the regular prisons, as well as Gaza as an open prison, and Palestine itself. And they insisted that there is a need for international law to be implemented, as has been going on with the International Court of Justice that has been initiated in South Africa, as a symbolic and a practical sense of solidarity with the Palestinians and other international bodies to promote and support ending the genocide in Gaza immediately, and ending all support to the Israeli occupying regime. I'll turn it now back to my colleague, Dr. Tomomi Kinukawa.
Yes, so the questions that we will focus on today includes what are our responses to those Palestinian feminists' emphatic and collective calls, and how would we centralize Palestinian feminist women, non-binary people's work, and also how we pay attention to the significance of our collective for our work against colonial feminism. And the question relates to some other questions, such as how do we individually and collectively locate ourselves within the academy what do we think and critique colonial feminism, and what is anti-colonial feminism, and what counts as feminist praxis, and what does it require, how do we practice it, and what are the relevant ethical and moral imperatives that are essential here. And so it is our hope that this open classroom not only critiques colonial feminism, but more importantly discuss how Palestine has transformed feminist praxis, and in the process responds to the calls Palestinian women issued to us during our open classroom, making International Working Women's Day on March 8th, and present major ingredients of our visions for feminism as they relate to abolitionist, decolonizing, decolonial, anti-colonial, third world feminisms, as we share our collective praxis and forging our collective perspectives, including our struggle around Western media, politicians, the UN, NWSA, and so forth. And finally, we'd like to discuss how our open classrooms center Palestinian feminists reconceptualizing and revolutionizing feminist praxis, and build transnational solidarity. Dr. Abdulhadi.
Thank you, Professor Kinukawa. So what we were going to be doing today is we are going to have 2 rounds of questions, and we will ask the 2 questions at the same time and ask our colleagues to the first round that will be introducing themselves, the second round, and I will leave the reading to the questions to my colleague, Dr. Kinukawa, and the second one will be following up on this. The 2 questions will be about how did Palestine transform feminist praxis, and what's our critique of colonial feminism. But my colleague, Dr. Kinukawa, will expand more and introduce the speakers who will introduce themselves. And then we will do another round for us to communicate and connect with each other and reflect on each other's comments and critiques. And then we will leave some time at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So I'm going to, and calls to action. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Professor Kinukawa.
Okay, so I think that covers most of it. So for our questions, we have been asked. I think we said it already, didn't we?
Yeah, but it was shortly. So you do want to expand?
Would you like to? Okay. So our questions: how has Palestine transformed feminist praxis? What are our response to the Palestinian feminist cause at the Open Classroom on March 8th? That's the first set of questions, and then the second set of questions is our collective and multiple perspective critique of colonial feminism that undermines Palestinian and other anti-colonial resistance movements. How do we, how do we critique the colonial feminism? So that's the second set of questions.
And the order we will have Dr. Sima Shakhsari speaking on colonial feminism and Zionism. We will have Dr. Mary Jo Klinker speaking about the struggles within the National Women's Studies Association. We will have Dr. Brooke Lober speaking about anti-imperialist feminisms and the role of white feminists in supporting freedom and liberation in Palestine and the U.S. Turtle Island, including the role of Jewish anti-colonial feminists. And then we will go to Dr. Alia Al-Saji, who will speak about the connection between disability advocacy and studies and the ongoing genocide in Palestine. And then Dr. Tomomi Kinukawa will speak about comfort, women justice, and Palestinian resistance. And then I will end the round with my own analysis of colonial feminisms and Palestinian resistance. And so we are addressing the 2 rounds. So I will pass it on now to Dr. Sima, and then that's the order: Dr. Sima, Dr. Mary Jo, Dr. Brooke, Dr. Alia, Dr. Tomomi, and myself. And so please start with the first round. 3 to 5 minutes for the first round, and the second round is 3 to 5 minutes. So each person can take 6 to 10 minutes to respond to the first 2 rounds, and then we will open another round. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Shakhsari, and the bios will be posted online for our students and colleagues and public to read them. So we save time from the presentations now. So Dr. Shakhsari, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdulhadi and Dr. Kinukawa. It's an honor to be on a panel with wonderful colleagues here. Thank you for having me, and also Lais and Lynn for all the work that you do. Lais and I are a part of Educators for Justice in Palestine here at the University of Minnesota. So I'm here in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is the ancestral and current land of Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. And of course, our university is built on stolen land. So, and also Ramazan Kareem to those who observe, and I pray for all the people in Gaza, the West Bank, and also people in Lebanon who are being bombed by the genocidal Israeli state. My understanding was that before we get to the 2 questions, we say a few words about the work that we do. I teach in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and my work generally is on politics of death. And so the genocide in Gaza, while I specialize on Iran and Iranian diaspora, the genocide in Gaza is quite relevant to my academic work, but also for as long as I remember, I have been passionate about the Palestinian struggle for freedom. I grew up during a revolution in 1979, and one of the slogans that people would say was Iran shode Palestine, Mardom chero neshestin. Iran has become Palestine. Why are you sitting, people? Which basically points to the military and also financial connections with the Shah's regime and the Israeli state before the Iranian Revolution. And of course, when I was a leftist child, there was a Palestinian leftist band that came to Iran, and that's when I learned about Tel Zatar, which was a massacre that happened actually in Lebanon in collaboration between the Phalangists and the Israeli state. So Palestine has been really a part of my psyche and my political, in a sense, consciousness from a very early age. I don't teach classes this year. I'm on sabbatical, but I have been on campus quite often because of the genocide that started in October. And we formed an organization that was basically a kind of a response to academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And we have now Educators for Justice in Palestine. So I know that if I want to talk about the questions about colonial feminism, of course, I'm sure that Dr. Abdulhadi will address colonial feminism in more detail in her reflections at the end, but I'll just bring an example of how colonial feminism works. Kamala Harris was in Minnesota to defend abortion and to kind of speak against the backlash on abortion rights, which is quite ironic because of the genocide that the US has been funding and supporting. And of course, many of us, I'm a part of also a coalition called Minnesota Free Palestine Coalition. So we kind of pointed to this form of colonial feminism and its hypocrisy when 32,000 Palestinians in Gaza have died, and 10,000 of them are women. Many of them pregnant women who don't have access to healthcare at all. women who have to go through C-sections without anesthesia, without any kind of pain medications, women who basically give birth under unsanitary conditions, women who are starving, newborn children who are starving and dying in Gaza. So the kind of colonial feminism is really we see in action what's happening with people like Kamala Harris, who have claims of defending women's rights and reproductive rights. Yet when we think about reproductive justice as people who think about feminism beyond the concept that colonial feminism assumes, which is basically certain women who are reduced to their biology or assumed to be human, who are worth protecting and defending, while other women, Palestinian women in particular, are assumed to be subhuman, and therefore not only do they not have rights, but they're actively killed in the name of women's rights, in the name of protection of women's rights. The other example in the context of colonial in the context of Palestine in relation to colonial feminism is the way that sexual assaults of Palestinian women and men and queers in Palestine are completely ignored by feminists who have claims of defending queer rights or women's rights, while the allegations of the Israeli state about the rapes committed by Hamas have justified this genocide that to date has killed more than 32,000 people. I know I'm out of time, so I'll stop here, but I can talk more about that when we come back to reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry.
My apologies, I lost my sound.
Okay.
Yes, so I was thinking that people will pass it around according to the same order that we've agreed. So Dr. Mary Jo Klinker next, and then afterwards Dr. Lober and Dr. Alia Al-Saji, and then Dr. Kinukawa and myself. So I'm not going to, you pass it on. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabab. My name is Mary Jo Klinker. I use they, she, and they pronouns, and I'm speaking to you today from the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people in Winona, Minnesota. I'm a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Winona State University, where I'm both a labor activist and rural community organizer, addressing the sexist and racist impacts of carceral systems in my community. I speak to you as a member of Feminist for Justice in and for Palestine Today, which is a collective that was central to the organizing and implementation of boycott, divestments, and sanctions at the National Women's Studies Association in 2015, and which seeks to protect and strengthen BDS commitments in our feminist spaces. I want to just thank briefly Dr. Kinukawa and Dr. Abdulhadi for bringing us together, and Lean and Laith for your labor, and especially to the fellow panelists for this critical discussion on deploying feminist praxis during this ongoing genocide against Palestinians, which is being bombed by Israel and funded by the United States. In response to the question about how Palestine transforms feminist practice, I just want to open with Dr. Irene Hawari's statement. She stated on March 8th, quote, "Our feminist demand is resisting the fragmentation of justice. We expect solidarity from Western women or from Israeli women against their colonial system, not against our men or our people. I just want to say that a feminist project could be very beautiful when it's comprehensive endeavor for justice, and it could be very ugly when it perpetuates injustice, oppression, and tyranny. We would feel feminist solidarity only when it is against the colonial system," end quote. This demand is one that I believe must shape all of our praxis urgently. For me, I want to begin by discussing how I see this in the university, in labor organizing, and in community abolitionist practice. So as I mentioned briefly in my bio, I've been organizing with a rural group of people to wage a multi-year campaign to stop the building of a rural police training center. And last year we were able to stop them from demolishing the youth rec center. And today we are seeing over 70 cop city type training facilities being built across the country. And I bring this up because following the summer of 2020 and critical uprisings against state violence and racism, there has been a racist backlash to increase policing and surveillances in communities across the United States. And I think it's inextricably linked to the colonial project of militarization and the prison industrial complex, which benefits from the co-imperial projects of the United States and Israel, including their deadly exchange process with policing tactics between United States police and Israel, and in the small town of Winona, Minnesota, where I'm at, and why they're attempting to build not only a regional training facility, but also seeking the funds from the Homeland Security in order to build it. The summer of 2020, the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct was burnt down as an act of resistance against state violence in the uprising following the murder of George Floyd. And last week, signs covered the vacant lot reading, quote, "Pledge to resist genocide and ceasefire now," end quote. State oppressions are interlocking, which means our collective liberation must also be interlocking from Turtle Island to Palestine. Another place that I see this transformed feminist praxis is in Feminist for Justice in and for Palestine organizing and archiving the important work of feminists to demand boycott, divestments, and sanctions. And I wanted to bring into this collective space in this classroom today words from an interview I conducted with Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi in June 2022 about the historic vote for boycott, divestments, and sanctions in National Women's Studies. She states of a very historic moment in 2014 in Puerto Rico, quote, "Remember, it was more than 2,000 people in the plenary. They had all stood up and started clapping. The night before was Bell Hooks, the keynote. And when I asked her, do you think that this is a place that we should do something for Palestine? She said 100%. The ground was shaking. We had so many of us. We collected 800 signatures in less than 24 hours. It was the fact that we were in Puerto Rico, in San Juan, and the Puerto Rican women said, this is our land and we are here. Everyone was going around, I remember it, the clipboards. I think this is something that is really important when we come and talk about the victory. It was working together. We made this happen. We struggled and got signatures. Many people signed, even knowing that they might suffer. It was really a movement that brought scholarship, that brought in good energy, that brought in relationships between younger and older, that spoke about gender and sexual justice, not about the essentialization of women. It was beautiful. It exemplified everything I stand for. Later in the interview, you went on to say, until then, I felt we Palestinians were coming from the outside. The National Women's Studies Association had historically been a Zionist domain. It has also been a white supremacist and Islamophobic domain. It was an Orientalist domain, a class elitist domain, end quote. I share this because I think it shows the importance of naming colonial feminism and its collaboration in US academic institutions, documenting their harm and the ways that they have erased the narratives of Palestinian women and third world women's resistance. Of course, Feminists for Justice in Palestine collectively documented in Armando Weiss' statement this last summer that in 2022, the boycott, divestments, and sanctions was undermined at the National Women's Studies Association, and that we needed to hold the NWSA leadership accountable for crossing the academic picket line in clear violation of the organization's 2015 resolution committing to solidarity with Palestine. Strengthening and protecting BDS in the sites that we inhabit, be it labor, academic, in organizing, are material practices of the solidarity we discussed for the International Women's Day several weeks ago. And I will stop there for right now.
Thank you, Mary Jo. It's great to hear all that from you and to hear you contextualize the work that we've done together in larger movements as well. My name is Brooke Lober, and my work is in gender and women's studies. I teach at two universities, at the University of California, Berkeley, and also at Sonoma State University. And my classes are often on decolonial feminisms, kind of considered in a transnational frame, and I'm using the knowledge production from those movements to teach courses. And in my organizing work, I've worked with a number of organizations that are doing Jewish organizing within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and most recently working with Jewish Voice for Peace Bay Area, also the Havarah for a Free Palestine, of Kahila Community Synagogue, both of which are located here on unceded Ohlone land. And I can say that Indigenous communities here have had a very serious victory this week. The Shell Mound, an important sacred site, has been returned to Indigenous hands. And that project was led largely by Corinna Gould and the Sagorate Land Trust that has been promoting this idea of the rematriation of land back, of Indigenous stewardship and leadership on this land. And I think that is an important example for us to think about, right, as anti-colonial feminists. So I'm a Jewish anti-Zionist organizer, and as part of that work, I've been working on understanding Jewish feminisms, especially those that have been produced in the United States, in relation with race and coloniality, with a focus on white supremacy and Zionism as racial structures, both in the United States and the Israeli state. So to respond to the first question, how has Palestine transformed feminist praxis, and what are our responses to the feminist calls at the Open Classroom on March 8th? I think that at the Open Classroom on March 8th, we were called as feminists to oppose genocide and more broadly to oppose colonialism. That really was the message that we got from all of the feminists and the women organizers who joined us that day. And they contextualized that in terms of labor, especially around March 8th, International Women's Day, International Working Women's Day. But I want to focus my response, especially on the work of Lina Mayardi, Dr. Lina Mayardi from Birzeit University, what she shared that day, and also what other Palestinian feminists are kind of bringing to us. And I'll bring it back around to the question that I've been asked specifically about Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish and white women's participation in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements. But Dr. Mayardi said, and I'm going to quote her, "For Palestinian feminists, feminism entails building an alternative, emancipatory, and just world, a decolonial world in which all human beings live with freedom and dignity. In our current world, in which atrocities prevail, building a just world entails the struggle against all intersecting forms of oppression, exploitation, racism, and colonialism employed by imperial, colonial, capitalist, racist regimes. And since forms of power are intersected, our resistance should simultaneously confront all these intersected forms." I think that what I've been focusing on lately is the work of Palestinian feminists. And what we hear from Lina Mayardi, I think, is maybe contextualized in a broader field of Palestinian feminisms that are calling on feminists across geographies and across formations to de-exceptionalize Palestine and to produce forms of struggle, right? Forms of feminist struggle that can respond to these intersecting forms of power that are so deadly in the situation of Palestine. Recently, Nadara Shalhoub-Kevorkian was on the Makdisi Street podcast, and her discussion there is a kind of, we see her really in struggle. We see her in struggle to face the contemporary moment. And what she's talking about is actually the materiality of bodies under bombs, and the way that what she uses an Arabic term, she uses the term ashla, the scattering or the dismemberment of bodies under bombardment. And she talks about the ways that a counterpower has emerged, right, from ordinary people, from everyday people who insist on gathering together, on reweaving and on bringing back together the scattered form. Her first example among many is a father who's gathering the parts of his children who have been killed, and he's holding them in bags, in plastic bags, and he says, "These are my children." And she says that he's reclaiming his his ability to be a parent, right, against this power, the Zionist or Israeli regime's power to scatter, to tear apart. And she also relates this to the Palestinian geography that has been broken apart by the Zionist regime. Not only the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, and others in diaspora, but even within the West Bank or East Jerusalem, right, the occupation cutting apart geographies, area A, B, and C, right, from each other. And I think for Nadra Shahab-Kevorkian, it's a feminist act of resistance to bring the parts back together. So I wanted to name these examples of two examples of Palestinian feminists who are calling on this kind of feminist work, because I think that is what we need to respond to, or what I feel that I'm responding to when I think about the ways that Palestine has and is currently transforming feminist praxis. What I can say about my work in response to this is that I've worked to construct an alternative genealogy of feminism with a focus on Jewish feminism, because what I see is that the feminist response or a feminist practice of facing these forms of violence fails in liberal feminist forms. So what I've been seeking in response to the condition of Palestine and the response of Palestinian feminists to Palestine, to the decimation of Palestine in particular in the moment of the Gaza genocide, is to find acts of resistance among feminists and to reanimate those and reclaim those as part of feminist struggle. So again, following Lina Mayardi's work on Sumuth, I've been in particular focused on the experience of women who have committed themselves to resistance struggles. So I'll just name some of the women whose work I've been focused on, people who spent time as political prisoners in the United States, like Laura Whitehorn, Susan Rosenberg, and Judy Clark, all of whom were members of the May 19th Communist Organization. They joined the Black struggle in the United States, committing themselves to anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistance against the U.S. state, and spent time in prison, right, due to their activities against the U.S. state. Susan Rosenberg and Laura Whitehorn spending 14 years in U.S. prisons, and Judy Clark spending 40 years in U.S. prisons. And the reason why I focus on these Jewish women and their forms of resistance and their claiming of Jewish practice or genealogies and their identity in struggle is because I think that gives us an opportunity today to look at the work of white women and the work of, in the US context, Jewish and Ashkenazi women who have participated in anti-colonial struggle. I guess, I'll say to wrap up for International Women's Day, it wasn't only the women political prisoners as individuals, right, who committed to an anti-colonial struggle, but huge swaths of feminist and anti-racist and anti-imperialist movements that also committed to this. And so the struggle of the women political prisoners in the 1980s and 1990s became known throughout grassroots movements. And that's another place where I want us to focus right now. I want us to think about grassroots movements that have been animated in support of anti-colonial resistance struggle. And that's why I've focused on groups like Out of Control Lesbian Committee to Free Women Political Prisoners, Support Women Political Prisoners, and the group Women Against Imperialism, both of whom, right, kind of landed upon International Women's Day as a time to educate and to mobilize feminist communities around the struggle of women political prisoners and also the struggles for which they stood. I'll close now, but I want to read a little quote from Women Against Imperialism's pamphlet from 1982 called The Issue of Zionism and the Women's Movement, one of the many places where the women's movements that I'm talking about worked to express solidarity with the Palestinian struggle from their position as women under the U.S. state, as white women, and also as Ashkenazi Jewish women. So in April of 1982, Women Against Imperialism, a group of Jewish and not Jewish white women, many Jewish women, wrote, "We as women do not confront some separate structure of oppression, but the same imperialist system whose bedrock is the oppression of colonized nations inside the US and around the world. We know that women will never be liberated within a system that thrives on our degraded and exploited position. We can learn from the Palestinian and other liberation movements that we do not need to accommodate ourselves to this system. Imperialism can be confronted and defeated. It is in this struggle that the new woman is born. If we want to be a part of building a society where colonialism, women's oppression, anti-Semitism, and class exploitation can no longer exist, then we need to actively side with Palestinian, Black, Chicano, Mexicano, Puerto Rican, Native American, and all national liberation struggles, which are leading the fight to take this empire apart." I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Dr. Alia.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. So thank you so much to everyone who came before me. It was extremely eloquent and lovely what you just presented. Mine will not be as eloquent, but I'll try my best. So my name is Alia Al-Saji, and I work in the Department of Philosophy at McGill University. So I want to talk specifically, I think I propose to talk about disability justice and Palestine. And that's in particular because I actually taught a course in feminist theory last term that was on disability justice. And a segment of that course was took up questions of disability justice and the global South. And in particular, the focus of that tends to be in disability justice on Palestine. So I'm just going to give a little bit of I don't have any classes, unfortunately, right now. So were this class in session, it would have been a good one to have be present. So hopefully for maybe if we keep doing this till the fall. So I just want to give a sort of overview, and I'm sure people actually know this, but for the students, in case you don't know this background, there tends to be a difference, a very stark difference between the disability rights movement and what we call disability justice. So disability rights tends to focus on sort of legal frameworks, especially in the context of the United States, of asking for accommodations and rights within the scope of the Americans for Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is a huge, which was a huge gain for the disability rights movement, but is not in and of itself a progressive gain necessarily. So it actually instantiates a way of proceeding that is very much individualistic and very based on sort of legal precedents, right? So having the means to ask for and take someone to court in order to be able to get the accommodations one needs to be able to work, use transportation, etc. This is a long history, so I'm not going to go into that. But what's interesting within disability advocacy is the way in which disability justice gets defined very differently. And disability justice is actually a term that we owe to a collective of queer, feminist, people of color, artists and performers in San Francisco. And it goes back to the early 2000s, and the collective is called Sins Invalid. It's very much in existence. It's very much an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial project. And they, from the start, defined disability justice in a way that is not limited to the sort of borders of the United States and does not recognize. So the problem with disability rights is if you buy into that framework, you end up having to recognize the sort of statehood of the United States and of that empire as bestowing on you a certain kind of accommodation for your disabilities. But within the disability justice framework, the idea is that liberation movements, and specifically the liberation of Palestine, is very much part of sort of advocating for disability, of taking disability seriously. And the reasons for that should be obvious, but maybe aren't to many people, because I still see people asking disability justice advocates, specifically on social media, why they're advocating for Palestine, why they're so vocal on Palestine. And you encounter, on the one hand, a kind of silence within disability studies and disability rights sort of informed contexts with respect to Palestine, actually with respect to justice, questions of justice and liberation in the global South generally. And on the other hand, you encounter a very different kind of political activism and advocacy on in disability justice. And so Sins Invalid, the collective that I just mentioned, issued a statement quite early on and took a position quite early on in October already on making clear their commitment to Palestinian liberation and not just a ceasefire. So, and not just dismantling apartheid, but liberation, and as part of their own sort of project, right? Part of what they are aiming at. Okay, so why am I talking about it in this way? Because it actually ends up being extremely important for understanding what, so when people note that there are that people with disabilities are dying right now in Gaza because of malnutrition. For example, the case that became quite large in the media of Yezen Khafarna, I think, Khafarna, they treat it as an exception, as if the question of disability were always something to do with an individual and a kind of identity politics setting. But the question of disability, and specifically what other theorists have in critical disability studies who use a disability justice framework want to talk about, is a question of sort of mass debilitation of populations. So that goes, and people here might know, will know, the work of Jaspier Puar, but also going back further, there's lots of work by Global South theorists who question the framework of disability studies that centers itself on the United States and centers itself on the question of rights, and does not take into account how those rights are upheld or even granted based on the domination that the United States has as an empire elsewhere, right? And so there's a complicated history to this that means that you're having these very different conversations depending on who you're reading within disability studies and what sort of histories one is drawing on, and whether the focus can be anywhere, as soon as the focus leaves the sort of global north. So the question of disability justice is a fundamental one, right? Because when we look at the question of Palestine, because one of the ways in which genocide is perpetuated is not simply through death, right? It's through debilitation. And debilitation is a long, ongoing process that can involve a kind of, people will call it slow death, but it's actually a way of wearing down a population on multiple levels. So you will see that people who already have disabilities might succumb first, but it's also the case that it's a question of disabling a whole population in order to sort of bring on a kind of premature death, right? And so even if things open up, and even if you have a ceasefire tomorrow, you actually need remedies for that or go far beyond a ceasefire in order to be able to address the disablement that has been happening over years and years and years, and the disablement that has happened just in the context of the last 5 months due to malnutrition, but also due to rampant disease, right, to infection, to sort of using all of these different means of unclean water, et cetera. And this is, we know this from the context of North America, because this is what settler colonialism did in North America as well, right? So using disease, using limiting food, imposing starvation conditions, but also imposing unclean water, imposing all kinds of environmental pollution that actually means that a people will itself be debilitated in a different way. And that's not something that's included normally in disability studies, which focuses on individuals rather than on peoples, right? So I think I'll stop there and maybe take this up in the next round. But just to name some people that do advocate for Palestine in the disability justice context, I want to, and people may be familiar with this from social media and other places, but I want to in particular note Imani Barbarin and Alice Wong, who are these incredible, so Imani Barbarin is an incredible Black feminist advocate who has been talking about Palestine and Gaza and pointing out what people sort of miss when they do not take disability into account as they look at the genocide right now. And Alice Wong is another sort of amazing disability justice advocate that I'll just mention here. Stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alia. And now we'll turn to Dr. Kinukawa.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm Tomomi Kinukawa, and thank you so much for my co-organizer, Dr. Abdulhadi, and all the panelists, and I really appreciated what has been already shared. I'd like to briefly introduce myself and talk about my work, but I have been busy organizing this panel, and so I'm not as organized as for my presentation as other panelists, so please be patient with me. So I teach women and gender studies as a lecturer at San Francisco State University, and then I also for community I work with multiple organizations, but one of them is Comfort Women Justice Coalition in the San Francisco Bay Area, especially fighting against Japanese right-wing government's denialism, historical denialism, like denying its own colonial past and its own the colonial and wartime crimes and so forth. And in terms of, and also I am part of the Feminists for Justice in and for Palestine with some of the colleagues here. And in terms of my, I started to do the solidarity work with Palestine here in the Bay Area, like 4 years ago, when in the context of the solidarity building between the Comfort Women Justice movement and the Ahmed studies that Dr. Abdulhadi directs. And so there has been much collaboration among us to strengthen our solidarity for the liberation of and also for educating our communities to understand our struggles to each other. And in that context, I invited Dr. Abdulhadi to give a guest lecture in my WGS 150 in 2020. And that, long story short, that led into Dr. Abdulhadi gracefully accepted the invitation and then invited me to offer many open classrooms. I met open classrooms like this one. And it's been a lot of learning experience by organizing and co-organizing and offering those open classrooms and enjoying them with students in my classes. And but one of the open classrooms that we offered was about the Palestinian feminist anti-colonial narratives and with the Palestinian feminist icon Leila Khaled and with many revolutionary thinkers and activists. And that open classroom in 2020, the fall 2020, got attacked by Zionists and shut down by Zoom, which under the pressure of Zionists, and then also attacked by the SFSU administration. And so that was a way before this. Right now we are kind of in the period when like there's so much repression on the campuses, and so it happens like 4 years before that. And so those are some of the what I do. And so what I'd like to, in terms of my response to the Palestinian feminists from the March 8th, what that many of my colleagues already taught important points that they have shared with us. But one of the things that like I think my colleague already quoted from Dr. Lina Marl, but I want to quote from her as well. And she said like, Palestinian women demand political radical solidarity from revolutionary feminists who believe in dismantling all forms of oppression everywhere, feminists who struggle with us to liberate Palestine and engage with the global movement for the BDS against Israel as one manifestation of resistance. And one of the messages from all the panelists that I have been thinking about is like what does it mean for us to join Palestinian resistance, and what does that demand in terms of our work here. And so I'd like to also quote from Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi from her lecture on genocides, the Gaza genocide and resistance from last year, where she talks about the resistance. And she states that both nonviolent resistance, for instance, the Great March of Return in 2018, BDS strikes and popular committees, and armed struggle from the 1920s to the present have been met with severe colonial violence, collective punishment, and indiscriminate killings. Today, the cost of resistance is clear and is felt deeply, but the Palestinian people are aware, as do all oppressed people, that only resistance in all its forms leads to freedom, liberation, and return. And so, I have been thinking about like what kind of changes do we need to make in terms of both our academic work and also the activist work when we stand fully in solidarity with Palestinian resistance. and which includes both the, as Dr. Abdulhadi states, nonviolent resistance and armed resistance. And so I just pose that as a question for now, and would like to share more of my response a little bit later. But also in terms of the my academic context, when I think about this question in my academic context, so the one of the issues, so as I experienced the repression by Zionists, corporate media, and the university, along with the Dr. Abdulhadi, the one of the, I mean, I increasingly felt that dissonance with the, what is considered to be a typical normal practice in academia. And so the, racial capitalist careerism in academia, which has been used by Zionists and administration that colludes with Zionists to co-opt us, or even to make members of the academia as part of Zionist aggression. And so, and I, as a lecturer who is already marginalized in academia, I have been thinking about like how we survive in the margins of the academia while at the same time critiquing the repressive structure that has been instituted in academia by Zionists, by white supremacists, and also by others such as the Japanese historical denialists, Japanese imperialists, and others. And so that's another question that I have been struggling with, and it is important to look at the university, corporate universities, and their administration as a major part of the colonial apartheid states' repression over anti-colonial, decolonial, feminist, queer justice, etc., and regulating and repressing our speeches and teaching on our campuses. And it is important also, and this ties this back to my activism, that I also am interested in looking at the university as an institutional space, which many the states, not only US, but also Israel, and in my case, like I look at Japan, all those states are interested in the US academia in order to influence the knowledge production system. And also those states, US, Israel, Japan, etc., they also collude each other to not only like collude each other for their respective etc. colonialism and imperialism, including the knowledge production, and they use US academia to for their purposes. And so that's once, and then like for our movement and also for our academic work, like how to actually defy and also, counter and defy the forces that try to take over the knowledge production. That's another issue that I have been struggling with along with my colleagues, and one of the things that has been very much helpful and useful is to looking at those states and also their denialisms, their denials of their own colonial imperial violence and crimes has been to put them in a comparative frame, and and then also examine where those states their strategies of repression are connected to each other and connected to each other, and so that's for example, like the Japanese, it's very important to look at the history in which Japanese imperialism, colonialism have ties to Zionism, and more recently, like the Japanese government started to be more overtly pro-Israel, and their imperial colonial, like they started to they started to collude more with the Israel. And in that context, they also colluded to produce their denialist construct, like the lies, together in the US-based institutions. And so that's another place where we need more work to there's more need for co-struggle against those efforts. Not efforts, those attempts. And so those are some of the things that I do, and I'd like to finish for now and then feel more later in my next turn. So I will give this to Dr. Abdulhadi.
Thank you, Dr. Kinukawa. So I will begin by introducing myself. I was born and raised in Nablus, Palestine, under Jordanian rule and Israeli occupation. Most of my adult life, I lived under Israeli occupation. I experienced firsthand Israeli violence, curfews, and attacks, as well as specifically the stuff that's very much related to the whole question of gender and sexual violence. So, for example, when we were young girls going to school, we would be harassed all the time by Israeli soldiers in the jeeps. Of course, we were also harassed by Palestinian boys, but with the Palestinian boys, we could always go tell our families, and somebody will come and actually just tell them off, and they will stop. But you could never do that with Israeli soldiers because they were representing the military, the overall power that was dominating all our lives. I also experienced growing up to the phenomena that has recently been exposed in Hebron, where Palestinian women were made to be undressed and left for a very long time, as well as recently what Israel has done in Gaza in undressing, making Palestinian prisoners, not only men and boys and children, but also women, undress them for a long time as they were capturing them. And we saw this happening all the time. I do remember throughout when we were going, from example, like exiting Palestine, either through the Allenby Bridge to Jordan, through Jordan, or there's real moments when we exited through the airport, Tel Aviv airport. There were several experiences where I was asked, of course, as always, to take off your clothes so they can go and check them. They leave you in a cubicle, and sometimes they leave you on the bridge for hours, and you can't come out, because how are you going to come out naked to see, and you're locked in? And at the bridge also, at the airport, sometimes you actually missed your flight, and that did happen to me a couple of times. So this is something that's actually systematic, and it's part of the humiliation that settler colonial regimes and colonialism in general inflicts on people under occupation. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. I've been writing a lot about it, but I want to speak a little bit about our experiences in the US. And from my first experience coming to the United States, there I've experienced and I interacted with colonial feminisms. For example, in 1983, I had just moved to New York, and we went to all the women's groups that were organizing, asking to participate in International Women's Day, because International Women's Day is very important occasion for Palestinian women, for women around the world, but for Palestinian women, I'm saying that because it's part of a movement. And so within movements, all of these anniversaries become very much more amplified, and they act as a commemorating anniversaries and histories, as we argue in Teaching Palestine, and also to kind of like draw lessons, remind people of the history, say what's going on, and basically pose demands for the future. So in 1983 we did that, and to my surprise, we were being asked, and I experienced that, are you a feminist or a nationalist, by multiple feminist groups in the US. And the only two places that actually welcomed us was El Centro Puertorriqueño at Hunter College, and also Bedgar Evers Women's Studies College, where I was fortunate actually and honored to meet Betty Shabazz, who was Dr. Betty Shabazz, who was a professor at that time. These things, and actually that's what instigated us in New York to form the Palestinian Women's Association in two chapters, one in Brooklyn and one in Manhattan. And in 1986, various Palestinian women's associations around the US, we came together and we formed the Union of Palestinian Women's Associations in North America. And that's a very, very rich history that we can talk about another time, that most of people who speak and study and research feminism have no idea about and do not know what's going on, partly because that history is not written, so I'm writing it, and there have been only very few things here and there, but also because people are always organizing. You don't really have much time to sit down and write. So many people do not know about it, but also in our history. In 1985, for example, we invited Nawal Saadawi, the late Egyptian feminist Nawal Saadawi, to speak at our conference, UPWA. And then she told us this in 1985, she was in Nairobi at the Women's Congress for Women. And specifically, Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan took her on the side and told her, do not discuss Palestine. You can talk about South Africa or anything else you want, but do not talk about Palestine. This was also the age when the feminist movement, at least the dominant feminist movement in the US, was dominated by many Zionist feminists that Dr. Lober spoke about. For example, Gloria Steinem, Robin Morgan, Letty Cotton Progreben, and so on and so forth. And these also influence the women's studies and women and gender and sexuality studies. And this is what Dr. Mary Jo Klinker spoke about. And we don't have enough time to speak about that. But this has been the history of thinking about that. That actually goes back to the suffragist movement and the Seneca Falls Convention and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, even though they actually learned, they said that they learned from matriarchal societies in indigenous communities. Seneca was the name of one of the indigenous peoples' nations. And they also had been participating in anti-slavery meetings in Britain. They apparently, obviously, have not learned much about that. So when there was the debate, as we all know, around suffrage and the vote for women, Frederick Douglass, for example, the very well-known emancipation activist and organizer and leader in the Black community, suggested that let's not accept divide or rule. Let's not say either women or Black. Let's ask for the vote for everybody. He was rebuffed by the leaders of the women's movement, and so was I.W. Wells, who was criticized because she was a journalist, Black journalist, and she was very much involved in anti-lynching campaigns for Black men who were being lynched in the United States. And this is very similar to also accusations of Palestinian women and other women in anti-colonial context that we are not sufficiently feminists. We lack an ingredient of feminism because we talk about so many issues and engage in so many issues, and we're not submitting ourselves to the essentialism of what women are supposed to be, womenism are supposed to be. And this continues throughout. This continues post 9/11 2001 with the feminist majority. This continues with Hillary Clinton and what she has talked about. This continues with in the Aqsa Intifada with Andrea Dworkin and many others, and also even recently the statement by several feminists who actually are rejected the Israeli claims of gender and sexual violence against Israeli women. But the formulation of the language was that do not accuse us of not being sufficiently feminist. This was part of it. And I want to just give a couple of examples from ancient history, not so ancient, but ancient history. For example, in what we study in women's studies, and that's what I also studied in women's studies, one of the very well-known book that we studied was A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, who actually was a supporter, English woman, who was a supporter of the French Revolution and argued against Edmund Burke, for the French Revolution and its principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity. But nonetheless, in her argument for the education of women, she uses the most negative aspect in her that she actually uses as the worst indication, and she says we need to liberate women from this regalio, which is the harem, accepting and assuming that all women and all Arab women and all Muslim women were actually locked in the harem, not knowing anything about that, and not even knowing about the whole question of the class element of that in the harem only rich men can actually afford to have the harem. The rest of the population was not really engaging in that, and that was not happening throughout the Islam rule. But to come more recently, we also know about Gertrude Bell, who was one of the very well-known, supposedly feminist leaders. She spoke Arabic. She traveled throughout the region. She worked very closely with T.H. Lawrence, or who is T.E. Lawrence, who became the Lawrence of Arabia, and she supposedly was supportive of the independence of Arab countries and so on. And she was traveling, and she in 1921 she was part of something called the Cairo Conference, which was a conference held both in Cairo and in Jerusalem secretly in March 1921. And that conference was created basically the blueprint, gathered British experts to create the blueprint for the British Empire control in both Iraq and Transjordan, i.e. part of it is also Palestine. When people study Gertrude Bell, even, and they even acknowledge that she was a colonial feminist, many forget and miss the point that in 1921, at the same time, actually Palestinian women organized their conference called as the Arab Women's Association and continues with their organizing forward. And so this has been always very much part and parcel of the history that is always part of that. And the whole question of, are you feminist or a nationalist, keep coming at us. When I was young, and I spoke actually recently, not recently, maybe in the last 2006, 2007, and also when Tomomi, Dr. Kinukawa, and I co-organized the joint classroom on whose narrative, gender justice and resistance, a conversation with Layla Khalid. Zionists were quoting me saying that I wanted to grow up to be like Layla Khalid. And in fact, yes, I did say that even at the international conference on empire. And one of the leading feminists looked at me and said, I cannot believe that we are living in this age. When are we going to be in an age with Palestinian girls would not grow up to end up glorifying violence? And it's very interesting because it is the same language that the president of the university and the provost, by the way, all our administrators, top administrators, are all feminists. And I put it in parentheses, but I would say colonial feminists, used the language of glorifying violence when she was attacking us and targeting us. But that's for another discussion. But the reason I actually wanted to grow up to be like Layla Khalid, like many Palestinian women of my generation, we were very much influenced by a phenomena I call Jamilat Nablus, or Jamilat means beautiful, but actually is reference to the 4 Jamilat in Algeria who were part of the liberation movement of Algeria, and they were all arrested. And my actually elementary school was called Jamila Buhayrid after one of them who is still alive. And so there is this we wanted actually to grow up and be part and parcel of the movement. We wanted to be part and parcel of the society. I did not really want to actually have a quote unquote traditional life and go and get married and have children and so on. I really wanted to be part of that. Those things were very lost on people. And part of the women, and I'm going to just move to my next point so I can we can all have a conversation, which is the whole question of where Palestinian women at and what does Palestine do into feminist praxis. And I want to speak actually about Palestine in particular, and then we can talk about, as my colleagues have already spoken and articulated, where does Palestine affect feminist praxis and liberatory feminist praxis, anti-colonial feminist praxis. If we noticed last week and 2 weeks ago when we had the March 8th panel, Palestinian women, every single Palestinian woman who's a feminist who spoke, basically resisted actually flipping the conversation and speaking about the discourses of the colonizers. They insisted on speaking on their own terms. And indeed, this is what has happened as a result of Palestinian women's participating and the Palestinian resistance movement that enabled, because it's a liberation movement, enabled and opened spaces for women as well as other sectors to grow movements and demand liberation within our society, because with you cannot have a liberation movement that's also repressive and repressive to quote unquote half of the society and so on. So this has been very, very much part and parcel of that. So there is the whole question of resisting and refusing to even engage colonial feminists. And I want to end up with a couple of examples about solidarity and how Palestinian women work on their own terms. In 2011, when we were on the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Delegation, we gave a presentation at Al-Najah National University. We were hosted by Al-Najah National University in Nablus by the male president of Al-Najah National University. And we had a session with Palestinians from all walks of life, and most of the Palestinian women's movement came, including former prisoners who were from Jamilat, Nablus, from the 1960s, who were arrested, who were tortured, who were abused. This Rasmiya Ode was not one of them, who was actually raped in prison and spoke very elaborately about that. She was, I think, in Michigan at the time before she was deported by the US. But there were a couple of Palestinian women who were in prison and spent many years in prison and were liberated as a result of prisoners exchange that Palestinian resistance uses a lot in order to liberate Palestinian prisoners. And one of them, and they held hands with the members of the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Delegation. And they started singing "We Shall Overcome." And they knew every single word. Some of us were thinking, we shall overcome, and we know that in the movement, in the Black liberation movement, in the radical Black feminist tradition, and so on, "We Shall Overcome" is not necessarily the most revolutionary. It is the song of the civil rights movement, but it's not really the song of, like, let's say, Black Power movement. And but they knew every single word of it. And it stayed on my mind until in 2016, during the first prisoner and labor and academic delegation to Palestine that my colleague Dr. Lober spoke about when she quoted Laura Whitehorn, who was one of the members of the delegation. We had lunch, and on one of the tables there was the former Black Panther Hank Jones, who was also for a short period of time a student at San Francisco State University during the 1968 longest student strike led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front. And as we got on the bus and we were always conversing, Hank tells us the story about Maryam Shakhsari, who was one of the freed prisoners, who told him why they sang "We Shall Overcome." She told him that this is something, and this story was also repeated to us by another freed prisoner, Rula Abu Daho, who's a professor at Birzeit University's Institute for Women's Studies. They both said similar stories that when they were in prison, in incarceration, which Hanan Khatib spoke about 2 weeks ago, and also Yafa Jarrar spoke about, and Lina Mahari's research is about that. Every single person almost spoke about that again and again because of the importance and the centrality of the prisoners in Palestinian societies and imprisonment as a strategy for Israel. They explained that whenever they felt that they were being attacked the Israeli military was attacking them in the prisons and the prison guards and so on, they would always try to sing revolutionary songs from around the world. And this is how they came around to sing We Shall Overcome. This was one of the songs that they were thinking. The reason I'm saying this, the morale of all of what I'm saying here, is that there is the whole question about we focus on feminism because in its sense, the definition of it, feminism means liberation. So it's supposed to have values towards justice, towards freedom for everybody. And that's why there is also a problem when we speak about colonial feminism, because colonial feminism does not come out of the reactionary, right-wing, repressive. It comes actually from a progressive space. So when colonial feminists adopt a very racist, white supremacist, colonialist, orientalist, Islamophobic perspective towards women, queers, non-binary folks, and throughout the world, and especially in liberation movements and resistance movements, this becomes actually the hardest thing for us to deal with, because it comes from feminism. However, we do know that there are other kinds of feminism that not only have contested and they're no longer represented as alternative, but have historically existed from the time of emancipation and liberation, and that exists among not only indigenous, Black, Asians, Latinx, and labor and other marginalized communities of color, but they also exist among white, anti-imperialist, and anti-Zionist Jewish women that Dr. Lober has spoke about. So in this sense, we do have allies that contextualize this and contest that and speak about the support for Palestine and the enabling and making space for talking and thinking about how Palestine transforms a feminist praxis, especially my colleagues on this panel, and with whom I'm honored to be. And I also want to just mention as my last word as greetings and salutations for each and every one of you, because of the attack and the doxing and the targeting, because you speak for justice for all and the indivisibility of justice. And I'll stop at that so we can move on to the second round. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Kinukawa.
Thank you so much. So I think we wanted to go to the next round. And this time we'd like to first reflect on, I guess, comment on each other and reflect on each other. The presentations. Dr. Abdulhadi, is that what we wanted to do?
I think that's the reason we are actually debating this online, because we always construct our classrooms in a very organic and dynamic way, and we do it also with our speakers, because we're all part and parcel of the movement. We work with each other and figure out how do we want to do it. So even before, we thought that instead of doing 2 rounds with 2 different questions, actually we'll put the 2 questions together. Everybody can introduce themselves, say what they want to say, and then we will have another round so we can further the conversation among us. So we would like anybody who would like to jump in, and folks can call on each other and just comment, reflect before we open it to the audience. So who would like to start?
I will say a couple of words. I apologize. I guess I didn't get the assignment. I was asked to speak on Friday, so not as prepared as some of the people who were very eloquent. Everyone actually who was very eloquent on this panel. I want to continue on what you talked about, Rabab, which I think is very true, and also your work has inspired many of us, and talking about Palestinian feminists and Palestinian women being in the forefront of not just struggle for liberation of Palestine, but for feminist organizing and scholarship. I think what I want to pick up on what you said, which is colonial feminism not necessarily coming from the conservative camps, but being actually very much a part of not even liberal, but progressive kind of feminist scholarship or activism. And that is something that we have very much experienced right here in Minnesota, as I said, organizing on campus, both in the fall and this semester. And of course, I was one of the finalists for a position for Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the search was canceled altogether because one of the questions that I was asked to address was campus climate. And of course, you could not, this was in December, you could not talk about campus climate without talking about tensions around Palestine and Israel. And one of the questions that was asked from me was by a Zionist doxer, a faculty member who asked about, well, your department wrote a statement in support of Palestine, but you didn't say anything about rapes of Israeli women by Hamas. So I basically explained what Rabab said, which is basically the settler colonial and colonial strategy of weaponizing rape in order to criminalize and demonize and lynch and kill, the colonized men in particular, as those who are monsters, as those who are rapists, violent. And that is what we see in Palestine with rounding up of Palestinian men, undressing them, sexually assaulting them, in Gaza and, of course, other parts of Palestine as well. But I want to, so the hate mail that I got, some of them were extremely sexist, extremely transphobic, calling me names that were transphobic and sexist, wishing me rape so that I would understand the rape of Israeli women. So those are not the ones, those are, of course, are not the ones that I'm worried about. But there were also ones coming with real names of feminists who basically saying, how could you call yourself a feminist and not talk about or deny, they called me a rape denier, deny the rapes of Israeli women. And of course, I had said in my talk too that I'm neither confirming or denying. And I, as a rape crisis counselor, I believe survivors, but no survivor has actually come forward. And the state of Israel is very much using this as an opportunity to legitimize and justify its genocide against Palestinian people. So that's one group of feminists. But then within our organizing, and I think this is something that is really difficult, organizing, grassroots organizing that Brooke also talked about, comes with its own issues. So there are some trends that I have noticed, and one is our colleagues who are, despite being pro-Palestine, they still say that they want to be neutral. And those are the ones, of course, who get invited to speak by, more respectable. They play the politics of respectability, and as if neutrality is possible. When you are talking about, as our colleagues in Birzeit University in their statement said, there is no moral equivalence. There is no way that the colonizer can basically have its side, or so we are talking about very very skewed and unequal relations of power. But the insistence of some of our colleagues who are seemingly pro-Palestine to be neutral is something that puzzles me. The other one is this idea of nationalism that you talked about. We had a colleague who basically refused to participate in some of the organizing because they believe that raising a Palestinian flag is nationalist and anti-feminist. And that is a very, I think, also surface understanding of feminist histories of feminism in the Swana region and other parts of the world where anti-colonial movements have been, using nationalist discourses. And of course, feminists have been in the forefronts of anti-colonial movements in Palestine, as Rabab said, and in other places. So this kind of very reactionary and knee-jerk response to Palestinian flag, which has a very different meaning as any other national flag that has a state behind it, right? So we are talking about the people that has been under occupation for 75 years and under siege for 17 years, whereas Dr. Al-Saji said basically, a whole population that has been debilitated, 17 years of basically minimum calories required to keep a person alive has been going to Gaza even before October 7th. So, people who have been debilitated for a long time. So thinking about nationalism, I think, is really important. Rather than the blueprint of nationalism is anti-feminist necessarily, we need to think about complexities and context of anti-colonial feminisms. And then the other issue that is more disturbing to me is when we have not just Palestinian, but Swana people in the leadership for Palestine solidarity movements. There are these accusations of, when you talk about the urgency, this happened in our university, in our group, when we're talking about the urgency of this genocide, that every minute actually counts, right? As you were reading earlier, that every minute means more people who are dying. And the work that the coalition here has been doing is passing ceasefires. Coalition, when I talk about coalition, I'm not talking about the University of Minnesota, but the MN Free Palestine Coalition, where the most radical ceasefire resolution in the cities passed that actually calls for ending all aid to Israel, not just a ceasefire, but ending all aid to Israel. But calling that urgency being translated as white supremacist, as if calling for urgency, that using certain kind of organizing templates and selecting parts of it and saying that, to say that this is urgent is a strategy of basically white supremacy to make us work more, as if this kind of work is a corporate organizing. So I'm really also worried about forms of Orientalist language that is used against those of us who are from the Swana region to make accusations of despotism or white supremacy when it comes to leadership of these movements. And I'll say this quickly, which is the silence of many feminists despite their support on the personal level. And I understand the concerns that our untenured or our contract colleagues have. Those are real questions, real concerns. But I think for our colleagues who are tenured, there's no excuse to be silent. And I'm not just talking about white feminists. I'm talking about feminists of color who are very ready to talk about any other kind of oppression, but they're, progressive except for Palestine. So I think that is really important to think about. Why is there this fear and this silence when it comes to speaking about Palestine? And of course, the Zionist lobby has been very strong. And those of us who have been dogs, who have been subjected to all kinds of hate violence, including death threats, know that these are real. But the only way that they can actually corner those of us who get this kind of response is because our other colleagues are not speaking up. So if you're the only one in your institution who basically becomes the so-called black sheep, then it's easy for the Zionists and the pressure groups such as MACA, Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism, and Canary Mission, and so on and so forth, to basically single you out and make you seem like the crazy person, the person who is radical, the person who is not academic enough, and so on and so forth. So I think that silence to me is not justifiable. And I know that many feminists of color have been active and have been showing solidarity, but there are also many who haven't. And I'm saying this about my fellow Iranian scholars, especially feminist scholars, who were so vocal when it came to woman life freedom movement last year. And of course, that movement is supported by the US exactly because of the US interests in Iran, to impose more sanctions for military intervention. But when it comes to Palestine, they have been quiet. And that is something that I don't think is justifiable, because you have to make connections between the woman life freedom movement in Iran and the Palestinian liberation movement. And that, gets lost exactly because of the geopolitical interests of the US and what kind of knowledge production becomes marketable and becomes celebrated in US academia. And lastly, I said the last one was last, but I'm going to say one more because I ended very quickly. I thought I had only 2 minutes in the first part. So last one is the again, something that we have seen in organizing within our movements here is this division between activism and scholarship. We had people who actually verbalized that I am a theorist, I'm a thinker, not a doer. This is very much a colonial binary, right? Because this assumption that our work is only done in the classrooms and that we only theorize, and in writing, we are basically making the change. And if you're on the streets, if you join your Students for Justice in Palestine or other students who are organizing, then you're less of an academic, is a very colonial way of the binary oppositions of intellectual or rational, emotional, and mind and body, which come from very much the colonial forms of knowledge production. And I think we really need to get over that division and think about ways that so much of the classroom is being held outside right now, right, on the streets, that we need to learn, not assume ourselves as educators to be the ones who are teaching the other based on the books that we have read, but learning from Palestinian young people in Minnesota right now, in the Twin Cities in particular. The leadership of the coalition is Palestinian women, young Palestinian women who have been working really hard to pass ceasefire resolutions. The one on March 8th here, all the speakers were Palestinian women, young Palestinian women who rejected colonial feminism and basically talked about what it means to do solidarity work and what it means to do Palestine liberation work, and making those connections that unfortunately some of our colleagues in academia fail to make. So that's what I wanted to put out there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shakhsari. And I also, my apologies, because we were trying to figure out whether to do this or not to do this on this day, because we've been doing one thing after the other. So we thought we'll impose on you at the last minute and hope that you'll be available, rather than
be here. It's just that I don't have anything prepared. I'm just talking on top of my head.
No, and it's like, I mean, it's very clear that we need a lot more of these discussions, and we will continue. So we have next, I think it was Dr. Lober wanted to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I should say thank you, Sima. It's so wonderful to see you, and it's actually really so good to be here with you and to hear your comments. And you've been really vocal on social media. And one of the things that I appreciate that I saw you saying there at one point was asking academics to postpone their talks, because we actually should focus on the Gaza genocide. And I think that for me, I feel like when we think about the ways that feminist praxis is being transformed in this moment, it's not the only moment that we look at from the perspective of imperial war and we say who's being targeted right now, and we shift our attention and we turn our feminist attention toward that situation. But it is maybe the most dramatic moment for me in my lifetime of observing this ongoing horror, and actually the temporal aspect, the going on 6 months is absolutely a part of that. I think that one of the things that I've been thinking in this time, and the reason why I've been highlighting, my response and my reading of Palestinian feminists, is that I just don't know if we would even have feminism at all if there weren't Palestinian feminists right now who are reshaping and reorienting and renaming, right, the ways that we think about what a feminist entry into this moment is. I think that I think that Dr. Abdulhadi, you've shared with us also from your experience of living under military occupation and the gendered and the sexual, right, kind of components of that. We see the spirit of resistance, right, as central to feminist praxis. And I do actually think that that is happening in this time. I also think that it's something that grassroots activists, like Dr. Shakhsari just said, are claiming. And that's something that I want to share with, I want to share that with feminists. I want to share that with Jewish feminists. I want to share that with white people who are feminists. I want to share that with academic people who are feminists. You don't need to be an expert in the region of the Middle East or the history of the occupation of Palestine to have a feminist response to this moment, to engage in resistance and to actually de-exceptionalize Palestine, right? This is something that Dr. Lubna Khatami talks about in the context of ethnic studies, that both an abolitionist framing and also a decolonial framing will de-exceptionalize Palestine for us and make us see, right, that Palestine is one crucial center of feminist struggle, and certainly one right now where an entire society is being torn apart, right, by a genocidal regime. The appropriate response to that is to reanimate that society, right? And so I think that what is an anti-genocidal feminism? Right, this is a way that we can see the women life freedom movement. We can see the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina. We can see Black-led abolitionist feminisms here on Turtle Island and indigenous feminisms here as anti-genocidal feminisms. And I think that that is actually the praxis that we need to meet right now. The thing that I want to point out really quickly before I turn it over to other people is that I'm also, of course, tracing Zionist invocations of feminism. So yes, of course, the progressive feminist refusal to actually engage with life and death in the context of the Palestinian genocide is, notable. Those are our colleagues a lot of the time. There's also a subordination of feminism itself to the Israeli project of statecraft, right? The use of feminism in order to support Israeli statecraft. And in particular, we actually see people coming out like Batya Angar Sargon, who's a Zionist, kind of a post-feminist. We also see groups like Zioness, which is like an AstroTurf group. We also see groups like the Lawfare Project, headed by Brooke Goldstein, who have actually attacked Dr. Abdulhadi and Dr. Kinukawa in the context of the San Francisco State struggle. But what I want to say is that if you look closely at their work, they actually annihilate not only what they might think of as some appearances of forms of radical or revolutionary feminisms in a third world context, but feminism itself, right? So what happens is they end up not only saying, for example, in the situation that Dr. Shakhsari was talking about in the response to these claims, some of which are lies, right? Like the New York Times story that cited the case of Gal Abdush, some of which are lies, right, about the acts of sexual violence that have been attributed, right, to Palestinian resistance fighters on October 7th. But they also dismiss the Me Too movement. They also dismiss feminist anti-violence movements entirely, right, in their attempt to actually use feminism as an aspect of Israeli Hasbara. So I think that I hope that Jewish people who are feminists are looking at these kinds of insidious misuses of feminisms altogether as we continue to participate in this struggle. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lober. Dr. Klinker?
Thank you all so much. I just wanted to add, I've been really struck by how the claim of rape denialism has been used against both abolitionist feminist and now Palestinian solidarity organizers. It is used against both for exposing and rejecting the racism of carceral and colonial feminism. As such, I'd just like to take a moment to lift up the Feminist Solidarity Network with Palestine's incredible work in their piece, The New York Crimes, to show the white supremacist roots of colonial feminism. Through meticulous documentation, they were clear colonial feminists are handmaidens of genocide by using sexual violence to normalize the genocide in Gaza. As they stated, quote, every accusation is a confession, meaning every claim that Western journalists make of Palestinian men as sexually violent is actually based in the sexual violence of Israeli colonial regimes. Palestinian women, children, and men experience such systematic sexual abuse at checkpoints, in prisons, and through Israeli military aggression for more than 75 years of settler colonization. This is one of the most painful discussions of the open classrooms, Teaching Palestine, AMED, and Feminist for Justice for Palestine discussions that we've done in the last year when we hosted women who had been imprisoned in Israeli colonial prisons to talk about their experiences in girlhood around sexual abuse and the violence that they witnessed. It also reverberates deeply with the abolitionist movement of today. Mariam Kaba's work to end sexual violence names the prison as rape. So too is it an apparatus of colonial white supremacy used by both the US and Israel. In Kaba's open letter to the anti-rape movement in 2020, she and Dean Spade term prisons as, quote, serial rapists, and point out that the prison is, in fact, state enactment of gender violence, end quote. Prisons, colonization, and occupation are not feminist and cannot be made feminist. And as a white woman doing this work, heeding the words of Palestinian feminists, it is my job to work against colonial, military, and carceral systems designed for racist oppression and colonial racism of white women's protectionism. And I just want to take a moment to end by echoing what Sima and Brooke have shared, that Palestinian feminists and queer activists are providing us critical blueprints of how to do that work. Thank you so much.
Dr. Klinker. Now we have Dr. Alia Al-Saji.
So I think I'll just add to this list of the things that Israel uses to, so not only feminism and pinkwashing, obviously, but there's actually a whole element of disability nationalism that is used by Israel quite, and that continues, because you can see that in how they present the rehabilitation of IDF soldiers who have been injured, right? So they do these whole long exposés of sort of that it's the best society for disabled people, right? In the region. That in fact this is like, and so it's a really interesting part because it brings in a lot of other things together. And the way that disability ends up being taken as sort of this exceptionally, that is this vulnerable population that is rehabilitated and taken up, has to do with a very sort of a trope that you find in US military sort of uses of disability as well, which has to do with the sort of use of prosthetics, military prosthetics, augmentations, etc., in order to rehabilitate that body and render it again a kind of militarized body, right? That it will be the and so there's this whole really problematic and sort of use of this. And if I find my source of Hasbara is Israel Twitter. And so if you ever go on there, you can see all of these discourses being weaved together along with the sort of multicultural kind of thematic as well into a justification of this colonial settler militarized regime, right, that uses military technology to rehabilitate disabled bodies that will then render them again militarily capable. It's this very insidious sort of use. And this particular aspect, as well as just calling out disablement as something that's not simply individual, but has to do with debilitation of populations on the whole. And I don't mean just because, so not just through particular tactics, but even through like checkpoints, right? So through through what Rabab, what Dr. Abdulhadi was discussing, in terms of those are modes of disablement, right? Those are like ways of impinging on movement within a space that if we think about it, it's not about individual bodies particularly. It's about sort of stopping the flow of movement where across one's indigenous land in particular ways. So the way in which disability justice thinks about disability is not as something belonging to a body, but as like processes of disablement and debilitation across time and across space. So access to one's history as well, right? There's a whole long sort of, you can think of it as an extended body, but you can think of it as a social body that's being cut up, right? So I think going back, Brooke, to Dr. Lober, to your citing of, I think it was Kevorkian, right, on dismemberment. And I think so there's a really I mean, I won't, but there are these really interesting connections once we were able to sort of not focus on a kind of very limited, because I'm not against identity politics per se, but a very limited view of what identity politics is, that enables seeing all of these connections in a much more interesting way, and enables us to see, and I should have said in the very beginning, that actually a lot of the disability studies movement or discourse comes from feminism. So a lot of it is using feminist methods and strategies, and that's why the main thinkers tend to be feminist, which doesn't actually necessarily solve the problem. It's another sort of way in which colonial feminism manifests, right? And that has been very much resisted by feminists of color and disabled feminists of color in particular. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Saji. Dr. Kinukawa?
Yes, thank you so much. So I'd like to speak to this issue of academics of color who are colluding with Zionists and not speaking up, and etc. That's one thing. And also I'd like to talk about the significance of connecting movements in the context. And I'd like to talk a little bit about conforming and justice movements, which has been ignored by colonial feminists. Like, it's not considered to be feminist issues in that context. And so it's very important for us to tie each other the movements which have been dismissed as non-feminist issues. And so but going back to like academics of color, we have been experiencing that in at this FSU as well, especially the administration, like the many faculties of color who turn into administrators, not all of them, but who actually do become part of the university Zionist complex, and then make lots of repression against Ahmed studies, for example, or like students and so forth, and like prohibiting teaching Palestine and doing like a daily violence, like and making it impossible, for example, for Dr. Abdulhadi to actually do what she is hired to do, but just to respond to all these attacks, and which often takes in the form of bureaucratic, bureaucratic aggression, I guess. And and then in that, I see lots of especially Asians, East Asians, it's like a privileged Asians in that, and so, and I'm just thinking about that, and also in other contexts, like when we look at the redress reparation movements, Zionists have been co-opted the movement for a long time as well, right? So they reached out to communities of color, and then offered some support for their redress and reparation movements, and then in exchange, they got that they requested legitimation of Israel Zionism, and started to speak the same language, such as conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and sometimes connecting to anti-Asian hate and so forth, right? And that started very early on, like in my partial research, like in the 1970s, like there was a lot of powerful Palestinian movements that, and also third world, the liberation movements that, that were winning in many fronts, including like a UN and so forth. And then Asians were part of that, and PLO still has, but the office in Tokyo, and they were very active, reaching out to anti-colonial movements and the labor movements, etc. Like the movements there, and like there's a building solidarity, and like even like central politicians first, like a center in the politics, were influenced by that movement and so forth. But then if I'm just looking at the Asian context, East Asian context, and I can't speak for any other places, but but then in the 80s, like in reaction to that, Zionist organizations started to like send their own people to, for example, in Japan, and then create their own posts and started to their own campaigns. And then and then also like spying on Japanese American organizations and so forth. And so that's when, like, for example, like they reached out to Japanese American Citizens League, which is a major, like a dominant organization that was doing Japanese American concentration. I mean, like a redress for the Japanese American like incarceration during World War II. And then so the Zionists offered help for for them to pass like a the bill for their reparations. And then in turn, the JSCL actually supported supported the Zionist, the very racist campaign to actually reverse the UN resolution, which identified Zionism as racism. And like they have been doing the campaign for over decades. And then JSCL actually agrees to support that campaign against Palestine and so forth. I mean, this is just one of the examples, but so I think there is a need to articulate this history of collusion, and like it's very important for us to be able to articulate, like, I mean, to cut those ties that exist within the communities, and also within ethnic studies, within our administrations, and as like all over you're saying that it does, if all of us speak up, like it is there, no one will be targeted, like and then right now mostly Palestinian and scholars and also students are targeted, like because of the whatever the fear that's like the rest of the academy and the movement have. And so I do think that it is unethical actually that for the yeah, I agree with Dr. Sima that this is there's so much that needs to be done to make communities of color, especially East Asians, in my case, accountable for their history of collusion. And then I just want to say very briefly that in order to do that, I think, as Dr. Lober was saying, that I think it is important to make the history of resistance movements more visible, and also like the solidarity, the history of solidarity more visible. And Dr. Abdulhadi has been really doing a very important work, making the solidarity between many communities, but including in our communities too, like the Palestinians, and also our movements have been collaborating, and that's important. And then my final word is that, so the Call for Women Justice movement, which has been ignored, because it's not about feminism, and then colonial feminism. I do think it's important, and then also I'm part like a Chinese Korean, part Chinese Korean, which is like post-colonial population in Japan, which I argue that is still living in a settler colonialism, while like that Korea itself is no longer under Japanese official settler colonial rule, and so there are like movements which have been dismissed and like erased in the same structure of collusion of states since 1940s. And I think it's very important for us to make them visible and tie them so that we can speak together for our co-liberation. And like as many of you were saying, like what Palestinian feminists and others have been saying is very much leading us. And I think we are learning a lot for our strategies for the solidarity and movements. And then locally, we have been learning a lot from Dr. Abdulhadi. And I think that's, I do think that's both very much, I feel very privileged, and also it's very critical movement. I mean, I feel that we are expanding that movement in the in our area and needs to expand it much more. So I just want to stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Kinukawa. I'm going to just make a few points starting where you left off, because I agree with all of this stuff. First of all, I think, and I'm saying that to people who are watching, definitely need more. So more of these conversations and discussions. So hopefully you all will be willing to come back and talk about, continue these conversations. And the people who are watching, please also send questions on Arabic studies and teaching Palestine and feminists for justice in Palestine, social media spaces, so we will actually figure out how we can do it. Well, not that we're acting like customer service, but it would be really great to address questions that are happening. I wanted to make a few points, and I was actually reminded about the whole importance of actually putting things in a historical context. So especially when you, Sima, when you mentioned the flag, I was remembering, and in my research, even the Palestinian flag itself has changed its value throughout different times. So historically, the Palestinian flag was a symbol of resistance. And youth and Palestinians who were carrying the flag or wearing even colors of the flag, or even putting the watermelon, this is why the watermelon now is very popular, were actually shot at and imprisoned during the 1987 Intifada of the Stones. Now, after Oslo, and I do remember that even in my own research, there was an event that I was sitting at, and a very well-known Palestinian feminist activist sitting next to me, and they started singing the new Palestinian anthem, not the old one, that they took out all the revolution radical stuff of and made it much more, acceptable to the peace language and so on. But that's another discussion. They raised the flag, and I'm kind of telling you, aren't you going to stand up? And she said, what am I going to stand up for? They are showing them in the Israeli settlements. And so even the flag doesn't always have the same symbol. So, and the reason I'm saying this is because we really need to know. People don't know. People don't know the history. People don't know the context. People only make of what is going on. It links to all the questions that you're raising about who is allowed to speak and who's not allowed to speak, and who speaks for Palestine and who's not allowed to speak, and who's seen as authentic and who's not. Sometimes the only people who are authentic are people from Palestine speaking, who are living now in Palestine. But that doesn't actually work anymore, because now there is the whole question about let's say the economics, the economy, the political economy of academic work, of activism, of public speaking, of the social media. I mean, a lot of people think that everybody was a lot of social media that are actually really great. Okay, maybe some people have, but who has the time to actually always constantly be, writing and so on and so forth? So I think that's really important. I think also the whole question about why is it that we see a lot of left now having a serious problem with the whole question of Palestinian resistance. Well, first of all, there is the resistance issue, but because it's okay for the French partisans to fight and resist against the Nazis and have armed resistance. And the front page of the New York Times has an image of a grandmother from Ukraine creating a Molotov cocktail. And we know the Molotov cocktail is not a toy. Molotov cocktail burns and attacks. But then it's not allowed. The resistance is not allowed for people in resistance movement. And even when people even speak about victims of sexual violence and so on, like it's okay for a woman who is being attacked or something to kind of like take a knife and basically stab. That's fine. That's completely justifiable. But for people who are having the gun on their head all the time, it's not allowed. That's one action. The second aspect of it. So part of it has to do with Orientalism and anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racism and so on. But the other part of it has to do with secular fundamentalism. Because the leader now of the Palestinian resistance movement, not the only one, are Islamist groups. There is this whole leftover from the left in the past, because Islamist groups at some point did play reactionary role. But people haven't read the memo or don't want to read the memo. So there is the secular fundamentalism that's constantly there, that you will see it coming in all sorts of ways. The other couple of things that I wanted to say is, why is it? This is why the narratives are not allowed. This is why our class was shut down, because to actually have Layla Khalid come on screen and speak like at the time 76-year-old grandmother and sound like everybody, and actually come into the homes and the screens, and it was COVID at the time, and the schools and so on of everybody, demystifies the image of the monster, of the terrorist, of the crazy, of the irrational, of the person who only wants to attack Israel. And not that there is the big debate about plane hijacking. But also, by the way, plane hijackings were also to liberate Palestinian prisoners. Go over the history. It's always about, because Israel keeps catching people and torturing them. So that in itself, silencing, is really, really important. And the last thing I wanted to speak about is the ways in which our colleagues, which Sima and Tomomi touch upon, our colleagues who are colleagues from indigenous communities and communities of color, are actually fighting us. And this has to do, and I think it's really important when we talk about Palestinian feminism and anti-colonial feminism, the importance of bringing all issues together. We cannot just say it's race or nation. We cannot just say it's class. Class is also very much part of it. People building their careers, moving in their careers, getting rewarded for shutting down, certain Palestinian stuff and so on. That's part of it. And also we really need to think about the ways in which also race is mobilized and weaponized in order to silence and shut down. And that becomes really, really difficult. So I think the ways in which Palestinian anti-colonial feminists, and the feminism that I'm very proud to be part of historically and continue, is a feminism that speaks about the indivisibility of justice. That we cannot talk about one liberation for one part and not liberation for the others. And this is something, then we bring in all these issues together, and then we can actually discuss them and work on them. So I'm going to stop, because everybody needs to go and do their own work, and just thank this amazing, on behalf of Dr. Kinukawa and myself, we've been doing this for a very long time, this radio show, and we like it, we love it, we love to talk with everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Each one of you has made such an amazing contribution. We will talk about possibilities, later on, and we still want to do another. We said at least a series of 3 sessions or whatever. So we will do much, much more. Thank you for your resilience, for your fighting spirit, because each one of you is fighting in your own way. Thank you for definitely Laith and Lean, without whom this would not have seemed so seamless. A very small team, we're doing a lot. And thank you for people who are joining us. And we will just say, until victory, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Goodbye.